I've been driving long haul for about 15 years now, and I thought I'd heard everything on the CB radio. Truckers complaining about dot inspections, warning about speed traps, the usual chatter that keeps you company during those endless nights on the interstate. But what happened last Tuesday on I-80 through Nebraska still gives me chills every time I think about it. I was about 3 hours into my shift, hauling a load of electronics from Omaha to Denver, when the whole thing started. The night was clear, not much traffic, just the way I like it. My CB was set to channel 19, like always, picking up the occasional trucker checking in or asking about road conditions ahead. I had my coffee, my playlist going low in the background, everything normal. That's when the screaming started. At first, I thought someone was just messing around. You know how some drivers get bored and start acting up on the radio. But this voice, man, it was pure terror. This guy was screaming about his brakes being gone, completely gone, and he was picking up speed going downhill. I could hear the panic in his voice, the way it cracked when he yelled for help. He kept repeating his location, saying he was on I-80 eastbound. But here's the thing that still doesn't make sense to me. I was on I-80 eastbound too, and I couldn't see any truck ahead of me or behind me that looked like it was in trouble. The guy was shouting into his radio, begging for someone to call 911, saying he was doing about 90 and climbing. I grabbed my own mic and tried to respond, asking for his mile marker or any landmarks he could see, but he just kept screaming. The same things over and over. Within seconds, other drivers started chiming in on the radio. I heard at least 4 or 5 different voices trying to help this guy, asking for his exact location, his truck description, anything that could help us spot him. One driver said he was about 10 miles ahead and would keep his eyes peeled. Another guy claimed he was coming up behind and hadn't seen any runaway truck. We were all scanning the highway, looking for brake lights, emergency flashes, anything that would give away a truck in distress. The whole time, this poor guy kept screaming into his radio, his voice getting more desperate by the second. He said he was passing mile marker 126, then 128, then 130. But I was right around mile marker 125 myself, and there was absolutely nothing there. No truck, no lights, nothing but empty highway stretching ahead of me. It was like this guy was invisible, broadcasting from some parallel road that none of us could see. The really weird part was how clear his transmission was coming through. Usually when someone's that far away, you get static or the signal cuts in and out. But this guy's voice was crystal clear, like he was right next to us. He started describing what he could see, passing a truck stop with a big neon sign going under an overpass with graffiti on it, details that should have helped us locate him. But none of us were seeing these landmarks. I knew this stretch of I-80 pretty well, and the truck stop he described didn't match anything I remembered. One of the other drivers even got on the radio and said the same thing, that nothing this guy was describing matched what we were seeing on our route. Meanwhile, his speed kept climbing. 95, then 100, then he stopped calling out numbers and just started praying into the microphone. That's when I really started to feel sick to my stomach. The other drivers were getting frantic too. I could hear the tension in their voices as they kept trying to coordinate, asking each other for their exact positions, trying to figure out where this runaway truck could possibly be. One guy said he was going to call 911 on his cell phone, but the trucker in distress was still screaming that he couldn't get through, that his phone had no signal. Another driver suggested maybe he was on a parallel highway or an old stretch of road, but we all knew the area well enough to know there wasn't another major route running alongside I-80 for miles. The whole thing was making my skin crawl because his voice was so clear, so present, like he was broadcasting from the truck right next to mine. He started describing more landmarks, a water tower with faded lettering, a billboard for some local diner, an exit sign for a town I'd never heard of. None of it made sense, and I could tell from the chatter on the radio that the other drivers were just as confused and scared as I was. Then his voice changed. Instead of just panic, There was this resignation creeping in, like he was starting to accept what was happening to him. He said something about seeing headlights ahead, about there being cars on the road that couldn't get out of his way in time. That's when my blood went cold, because I was looking ahead at completely empty highway. No cars, no lights, nothing but darkness stretching out in front of my headlights. He started apologizing into the radio, saying he was sorry to whoever might hear this, that he couldn't control his rig anymore. His voice was shaking, and I could hear him trying to steer, the strain in his breathing as he fought with his wheel. One of the other drivers kept trying to talk him through it, telling him to look for runaway truck ramps, to try his engine brake, anything that might help. But this guy just kept saying it was no use, that nothing was working, that he could see the impact coming. That's when we heard it. This awful grinding sound coming through his radio, metal on metal, like his wheels were sparking against the asphalt. He was screaming that his trailer was starting to jackknife, that he was losing control completely. The sound was horrifying. This screeching noise mixed with his voice, getting more and more desperate. I had my foot off the gas pedal, scanning every inch of the road ahead and behind me, but there was still nothing there. No truck, no sparks, no sign of the chaos we were hearing through the CB. Other drivers were reporting the same thing, complete silence on their end, while this guy's transmission was filled with the sounds of a disaster in progress. He yelled, something about seeing a family in a minivan ahead of him, about how they didn't know he was coming. I'll never forget the way his voice cracked when he said that. It was pure helplessness, the sound of someone who knew they were about to cause something terrible and couldn't do anything to stop it. The crash, when it came, was unlike anything I've ever heard. It wasn't just the sound of metal hitting metal. It was this deep, rumbling explosion that seemed to go on forever. Through the radio, we could hear glass shattering, metal twisting, what sounded like multiple vehicles being destroyed all at once. And then there were other sounds I don't even want to think about too much. The guy's screaming stopped abruptly, cut off mid-sentence, but the sounds of destruction kept going for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. All of us drivers had gone completely silent, just listening in horror to what we were hearing through our radios. When the crashing sounds finally stopped, there was this eerie quiet, then just the hiss of static. I kept my radio on, waiting for something, anything. Maybe sirens approaching, maybe someone else's voice calling for help. But there was nothing but that steady, static noise. I immediately grabbed my cell phone and called 911, my hands shaking so bad I could barely dial the numbers. The dispatcher asked for my location, and I told her I was on I-80 eastbound, around mile marker 127, that we'd heard a major accident over CB radio but couldn't locate it. She put me on hold for what felt like forever, then came back and said they hadn't received any accident reports for that area. I tried to explain what we'd all heard, but I could tell she thought I was either confused or making it up. Meanwhile, the other drivers were getting back on the radio, all of us talking at once, trying to make sense of what just happened. One guy said he'd called 911 too and got the same response. No accidents reported anywhere in the area. Another driver suggested maybe it happened on a side road or in a different county, but we all knew what we'd heard, and it sounded like it happened right there with us on the interstate. We decided to keep driving and watch for any signs of an accident, smoke, emergency lights, anything that would explain what we'd heard. I drove for another 50 miles, keeping my eyes peeled for any evidence of the crash. Nothing. No skid marks, no debris, no emergency vehicles racing past us in the opposite direction. The other drivers were reporting the same thing on the radio. It was like the whole incident had happened in some other dimension that we could hear but not see. One of the truckers, an older guy with a voice I recognized from previous trips, said he'd been driving this route for 25 years and had never experienced anything like it. He suggested we all meet at the next truck stop to compare notes and maybe figure out what happened. Part of me didn't want to stop, just wanted to keep driving and pretend the whole thing never happened, but I knew I wouldn't be able to concentrate. On the road, with all this weighing on my mind, we met up at the Flying J truck stop near Grand Island, about 6 of us who had been on the radio during the whole incident. I'd never seen most of these guys before, but we all had the same shell-shocked look on our faces. We sat around a table in the driver's lounge, drinking coffee and going over what we'd heard, comparing details. Every single one of us had heard the same thing: the panicked trucker, the brake failure, the crash, but none of us had seen anything on the road. One driver, a younger guy named Mike, had been recording his CB chatter on his phone for some personal project he was working on. He played back the recording for all of us, and hearing it again made my stomach turn. The fear in that trucker's voice was real, no question about it. You can't fake that kind of terror. But when we listened carefully to the background noise during his transmissions, something was off. There were no engine sounds, no wind noise, none of the usual ambient sounds you'd expect from someone driving a big rig at high speed. Another driver pointed out that the landmarks the guy had described didn't match anything along our route. He'd mentioned passing a Sinclair gas station with a green dinosaur sign, but there hadn't been a Sinclair station on that stretch of I-80 for at least 10 years. I remembered when it got torn down and replaced with a Casey's. The more we talked, the more details emerged that didn't add up. The exit numbers he'd called out existed, but not in the order he'd mentioned them. It was like he was driving a version of I-80 that was similar to ours, but not exactly the same. One of the older drivers, a guy named Frank who'd been hauling freight since the 70s, said he'd heard stories like this before from other truckers, but he'd always figured they were just urban legends. Ghost truckers, phantom accidents, that sort of thing. But sitting there, listening to Mike's recording again, none of us could explain what we'd experienced. Frank told us about something he'd heard from another driver years ago about CB transmissions that seemed to come from trucks that weren't really there. He said some old-timers believed that certain stretches of highway held onto echoes of accidents that had happened in the past, like the radio waves got trapped somehow and replayed when conditions were just right. It sounded crazy, but after what we'd all just experienced, crazy didn't seem so impossible anymore. Mike pulled out his phone and started searching for accident records on that stretch of I-80. What he found made all of us go quiet. 3 years ago, almost to the day, there had been a massive pileup involving a runaway semi that had lost its brakes coming down a long grade. The truck had slammed into a family in a minivan, killing all 5 people inside, plus the trucker himself. The accident report mentioned that the driver had been trying to radio for help in his final moments, screaming about brake failure over Channel 19. The location of that accident was about 30 miles east of where we'd been driving when we heard the transmission. But here's the thing that really got to us. The trucker's name was listed as David Martinez, and he'd been hauling electronics from Omaha to Denver, the exact same route I was driving that night. The accident had happened at mile marker 98, not where we'd been, but all the landmarks he'd described during the phantom transmission matched the area around that crash site perfectly. The Sinclair station, the water tower, the overpass, with graffiti. They were all there 3 years ago, before road construction had changed everything. We sat there for a long time, not saying much, just trying to process what this meant. If what Frank suggested was true, we'd somehow heard the final moments of David Martinez's life replaying over our CB radios, broadcast from a truck that had been destroyed years before any of us were on that highway. We tried calling the state police to report what we'd found, but explaining the situation over the phone made us all sound like a bunch of crazy truckers who'd been driving too long without sleep. The dispatcher was polite, but clearly didn't believe us when we tried to connect our CB experience to the 3-year-old accident. Mike suggested we drive back to mile marker 98 to see if we could find any evidence or explanation for what had happened, but none of us really wanted to go back there, especially not at night. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, like we'd stumbled into something we weren't supposed to witness. Frank said he'd been in touch with other drivers over the years who'd reported similar experiences on different highways, always involving truckers who died in accidents and whose final radio calls seemed to replay under certain conditions. He thought it might have something to do with atmospheric pressure or solar activity affecting radio waves, but honestly, none of us had any real answers. The strangest part was what happened when we all tried to contact dispatch or our companies to report the incident. Every single one of us got the same response. There were no records of our CB transmissions from that time period. Our company logs showed normal radio chatter, but nothing about the emergency we'd all heard and responded to. It was like those 20 minutes had been erased from official record, even though we all had clear memories and Mike had his recording as proof. When Mike tried to upload his recording to his computer later, the file was corrupted, just static, and white noise, where David Martinez's voice should have been. We exchanged phone numbers that night, promising to stay in touch and share any similar experiences, but part of me hoped I'd never have to use those numbers. The whole thing left me feeling like I'd witnessed something that existed in the space between life and death, something that wasn't meant for the living to hear. I finished my run to Denver the next day, but I couldn't shake what had happened. Every time I keyed up my CB radio, I half expected to hear David's voice again, screaming about his brakes. I started avoiding that stretch of I-80 whenever possible, taking longer routes that added hours to my trips just so I wouldn't have to drive past mile marker 98. My dispatcher noticed the change in my routing and asked about it. But how do you explain to someone that you're afraid of hearing a dead man's voice on the radio? I tried to go back to normal, tried to convince myself that we'd all experienced some kind of group hallucination or atmospheric anomaly. But the memory was too vivid, too real. The other drivers from that night started checking in with each other regularly, and we all reported the same thing: an inability to forget what we'd heard, and a reluctance to drive that route again. About 2 months later, Frank called me with news that made my blood run cold. He'd been talking to a trucker friend of his who worked for a different company, and this guy had experienced something similar on I-80 just a week after our incident. Same voice, same desperate pleas about brake failure, same phantom crash that nobody could locate. But this time, only one driver had heard it, and when he tried to get other truckers on the radio to help, nobody else could pick up the transmission. Frank's friend had pulled over and called 911, but just like with us, there were no accident reports, no evidence that anything had happened. The guy was so shaken up that he'd quit long-haul trucking entirely and taken a local delivery job. Frank said he was starting to think that David Martinez's final moments were somehow stuck in a loop, replaying for random truckers who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. The idea that this was still happening, that other drivers were experiencing the same terror we had, made me realize this wasn't something that was just going to fade away and be forgotten. The final incident that convinced me this was something beyond normal explanation happened about 6 months after that night. I was driving through Kansas on I-70, nowhere near Nebraska, when my CB crackled to life with a familiar voice. It was David Martinez again, but this time the transmission was different. Instead of screaming about brake failure, he was calmly asking for someone to check on his family in Omaha, saying he wouldn't be making it home for his daughter's birthday. The transmission lasted maybe 15 seconds, clear as day, then cut to static. I immediately called Frank and the other drivers from our group, and 3 of them had heard the exact same thing at the exact same time, even though we were all in different states. Mike was in Texas, Frank was in Colorado, and another guy was up in Minnesota. We were hundreds of miles apart, but we'd all received the same message simultaneously. This time, nobody tried to call 911 or make official reports. We all understood by then that this was something that existed outside normal channels, something that the authorities couldn't help with, even if they believed us. That was 3 years ago now, and I still hear from David Martinez occasionally. Not the screaming, desperate transmissions from that first night, but these quiet, sad messages that come through at random times. Sometimes he asks about road conditions ahead, sometimes he talks about missing his family, and once he warned me about a speed trap that turned out to be exactly where he said it would be. I've learned to just acknowledge his transmissions with a simple 10-4 and leave it at that. The other drivers in our group have had similar experiences, and we've stopped trying to make sense of it or find explanations. Some things just exist in the spaces between what we understand and what we experience. David Martinez died on I-80 3 years before that night, but somehow part of him is still out there on the highways, still trying to get home, still broadcasting on Channel 19. I don't know why some of us can hear him and others can't, and I've stopped trying to figure it out. I just know that the road holds on to things, and sometimes those things reach out to the living in ways we're not meant to understand.